Any history of Islam, even one as ridiculously short as this one, has to begin with Muhammad. Before, though, I tell the story of Islam in the way that will inform the rest of the module, I think that there are two themes that are worth paying attention to. The first theme is that of power. Like Christianity, Islam grew in a position and in a relationship with that of the state. Sometimes that relationship was very tight, in which Islam was the religion of the state. At other times, it served to check the power of the state. Unlike Christianity, though, on the other end, it comes to be influenced by the development of colonialism. How does the state and Islam respond, right, when it's in a colonial position? That's one theme. The second theme is that of diversity. Islam is incredibly diverse, and when you look at Islamic communities in Indonesia or Saudi Arabia or the United States and Canada, you see quite large divergencies between their practices and the ideas that inform them, to the extent that many scholars might say you can't even speak of a unified Islam. Of course, in many ways, the same could be said about Christianity and Judaism, too. So with that, kind of thinking about those themes, let me begin the story of Islam with Muhammad and the way the story is traditionally told. So Muhammad is born about 570 of the Common Era in the Arabian Peninsula, that is modern-day Saudi Arabia. He's born around the city of Mecca, which is the most important city in that area. It's a tribal kind of society. His own tribe was the Quraysh, which is a fairly powerful tribe, although he belonged to a lesser clan. He himself was not born into money. In fact, he didn't receive any education. That becomes an important part of the story of Muhammad. He becomes a shepherd, ultimately shepherding the flock of a widow, Khadijah, and together they marry ultimately and have a daughter named Fatima. But it's working as a shepherd, right, with his flock out there that he receives his first revelation. So according to the story, it's the angel of Allah, Gabriel, who comes down to Muhammad while he's alone, shepherding his flock, and says, recite. Muhammad, of course, doesn't know what to recite. And after a bit of pressure from Gabriel and some back and forth, suddenly he starts to receive the revelation of Allah. Those revelations from Allah to Muhammad, they're oral revelations, Quran recitation, right? This is all connected in the Arabic word. These revelations occur over many years. And ultimately, when one looks at the Quran, when they are a collection of these revelations, which is why the Quran actually isn't organized in a chronological way. It's said that some of the first revelations are actually in the later books of the Quran. And even within the particular chapters of the Quran, there's not a particular organization. So again, there are these blocks of text that were originally said to be oral revelations that are not necessarily connected to one another. Muhammad gets followers, and with him and his followers have an oppositional kind of relationship to the traditional religious practices of his day. Those religious practices largely revolved around things that ultimately in Islam would regard as shirk, that is, things that are separated from God, or what we might call idolatrous. Because this group was disrespecting the traditional gods worshipped in Mecca, ultimately Muhammad and his crew were driven out of Mecca, and they went to Medina in the year 622 of the Common Era, which becomes an important date in Islamic history. It's there that they begin to form, in this city north of Mecca, a community. And that community is known as the Ummah, the nation, the people. Medina already was settled, but they were able to establish themselves not just as a community, but in fact with Muhammad as the ruler within that community. That had to do with according to the Islamic tradition, had to do with conflicts within the city itself in which Muhammad was brought in as a mediator. It's there also that this group begins to establish relationships with the Jewish residents. Those relationships started out well, but they tended to get rocky over time. This issue of the Islamic relationship with Jews then begins at the very beginning of the Islamic story. And that same kind of tension and ambiguity, that it can be both positive but also lean towards the negative, is an embedded part of the Islamic tradition, and one finds it in the Quran. Over time, the tension between the Islamic community, the Ummah in Medina, and the community from which they came in Mecca, that tension grows. And in 630, it erupts into a kind of warfare. And it's Mecca now that's conquered. So at that point, Muhammad, the community of Islam, becomes not just a religion, and not a religion on the out, but is actually in the ruling power that's coming out of Mecca. So starting in 630. Muhammad dies, and there's a question of succession. So the succession begins with his own relatives, and is all in general. So Abu Bakr, right, who is not related to Muhammad, takes over as the kind of leader of the Islamic community. He becomes a caliph, right? And that starts this caliphate. The caliphate is largely a secular kind of office, or rather, it's maybe one could better say it links both religious and secular authority to it. Now, Abu Bakr is a conqueror, and he moves into the Umayyad community, which lasts from 661 to 750. Right? The Umayyads become this kind of group of Islamic rulers that rule out of Damascus, out of Syria. Later on, that will fall to a different group called the Abbasids, who ruled from about 750 to 1258 out of Baghdad, although there are branches of that come out into Spain as well. It's during this period of consolidation and Islamic conquest, military conquest, in the Umayyad and the Abbasid period, that we can begin to see this split between the Sunni and the Shia groups, or what would become the Sunni and the Shia groups. Shia begins with the succession of Ali to the caliph. Now, Ali is Muhammad's son-in-law. He was married to the daughter Fatima. He's murdered in 661 of the Common Era. As part of this struggle, it was thought that after Ali, there were 12 other imams. They're no longer caliphs, because the caliph goes over to this other group. But the imams are the actual biological descendants of Ali. And one of the foundations of Shia, what would become Shia Islam, is that the authority from Muhammad goes through the biological line. And in fact, the leader of Islam has to be a descendant of Muhammad. This idea that there were 12 imams following or after Muhammad, and that the 12th went into hiding, is called Twelver Shia. Twelver Shia is probably the most common form of Shia Islam today. Today, Shia comprise about 20% of the Muslim community, and the other 80% are considered to be Sunni. It becomes, as Islam grows, there becomes no central caliphate. There's no central ruler of Islam. Instead, it breaks down into different groups and different political units, all the way from India or Turkey or into the Middle East or Spain. All of them have their own kind of ruling authority. It's also at this time, it's during the period of conquest, that we begin to see an Islamic political theory develop. Things are treated differently in Islam, whether they are in places that are under Islamic rule, called Dar al-Islam, the kind of territory of Islam, or under submission, which is the literal word, is what Islam means, or Dar al-Harb, which is the area under warfare or the sword. And that's the area that's not under Islamic authority. The way that Islamic empires and Islamic political entities treat these two different spheres are significant. So this even occurs today when one thinks about whether the United States, for example, in Islamic thought is Dar al-Islam or Dar al-Harb. And there's actually a great debate among Islamic scholars over how to treat places like the United States or Europe or places with kind of political liberty. One thing that interests us, though, is also the idea of the jimmy. The jimmy is the term applied to the minority groups of Christians and Jews who live in Dar al-Islam. As the question here is, how do you treat Christians and Jews in an Islamic community? Christians and Jews, because they're thought to have had some kind of authentic revelation, are not treated as any other pagan idolater, as they would be thought of in Islam, who are given choices between leaving, dying, or converting, but instead are allowed to have a community within a Dar al-Islam autonomy. That community doesn't have equal rights. It's a disadvantaged community in that it pays a certain amount of poll tax, and there are certain things that it can't do, but nevertheless it is protected. So the jimmy are these kind of protected communities of Christians and Jews within Islamic lands. Through the Middle Ages, then, in these Islamic lands, you also begin to develop a collection of traditions about the Prophet. So the Quran has already been established as an authoritative book within the Islamic communities. Now you begin to see these stories collected. They are called the Sunnah, the life of the Prophet. These stories about the Prophet, sometimes they're his sayings, sometimes they're sayings about the Prophet, that begin to be seen as authentic. These stories are known as hadith, and they are collected into these larger collections, and there are many thousands of them, of these stories. They become quite important in establishing Islamic ideas and Islamic law. It's also in the Middle Ages that one begins to see a kind of reform movement, and that's the Sufi movement. So the Sufis, or the Sufism, right, is a kind of form of Islam that attempts to instill a kind of more mystical approach and an esoteric approach at times. That there is on the top, there may be Sharia, right, the law, which is all exoteric. Anybody could do it. It's available to everybody. But underneath, there's kind of a secret esoteric meaning. So Sufism develops as a kind of reform movement. One might kind of compare it to Hasidism among Jews, in which the joy of the tradition, right, is kind of brought into what was seen as, or what at least the reformers saw as, a kind of stultified legal tradition. So the Sufis begin to operate, and this begins to operate kind of over the layer of Islam, or as a kind of quasi-alternative to other forms of Islam that starts through the Middle Ages and continues through the present day. One of the more important historical moments, though, in the development of Islam in the Middle Ages were the Crusades. It's during the Crusades that one begins to see the relationship with Christianity coalesce, and not in a positive way. So this idea that Muslims and Christians are at war with each other is certainly not part of the Islamic tradition, but nevertheless is part of the historical experience, which becomes very scarring into at least certain parts of the Islamic tradition. The Crusades represent a break between Islamic ideas toward Christianity and Christian ideas toward Islam. That kind of relationship, that antagonistic relationship between Christians and Muslims, which of course you see in Spain, in the wars between the Muslims and the Christians through Southern Europe, that kind of continues on, that kind of antagonism, into the colonial period. So it's in the colonial period, right, where the Christians actually do come and they take over or kind of exert their authority over Islamic lands in places like Saudi Arabia, that one begins to see kind of this movement of power. So in this time, kind of Islamic communities that used to kind of combine Islam as the kind of state religion now have to reconcile themselves to a position of non-power. That, in turn, caused a kind of reformation, if you will, within the Islamic community. That reformation took several different forms. So it starts out with a kind of inward-looking form. That is, that you begin to see certain kinds of ideas enter Islam that talk about Islam as not being kind of outwardly centered in positions of political power, but inwardly centered to the self. And it's out of that idea that you begin to get certain kinds of other reformations. One, for example, is the Salafi movement. The Salafi movement is that which ends up breeding movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, which looks toward kind of getting back at colonialism and a kind of reintegration of power into the Islamic ideals. A second group, right, are the modernizers. And in modernizers, that too kind of breaks in different directions. On the one hand, you have modernizers who want to integrate Islam into liberal thought. So these are the modernizers who you might see in many communities, Islamic communities in the West, whether they're being in Europe or in the United States, Canada, who think that Islam can in fact coexist easily with Western liberal values. Then on the other hand, right, are the modernizers who move in exactly the opposite direction. Right? Groups like Al-Qaeda, the Islamists, right, who believe that these are two irreconcilable sets of values that in a sense are at war with each other. So the history of Islam in many ways today can be seen in this context of power and the reaction to colonialism. How does Islam, or how do Muslims react to the modern world? Do they take on the liberal values of the West? Do they assert a kind of attempt to get back at the power that they had in the past? Or is there some middle way? And this kind of tension animates not just the relationships between, well, Muslims and Western values, but in fact is a very active conversation even among Islamic communities today.